You know, it's funny how sometimes in history, just one month, small slice of the calendar can carry so much weight. Like all these critical moments just pile up, really defining a nation's path. Does a specific month jump out for you when you think about, say, your own country's history? A time when things really shifted?
Well, today we're going to do a deep dive into exactly that, but focusing on Eritrea. We're going to explore the really significant events that happened specifically in March, looking at its long fight for independence and then the struggle to protect that freedom afterwards. And just to be super clear up front, everything we're discussing today, all the details, the perspectives, it all comes from one specific source. It's an article called March in Eritrea's History, written by Haptem Tesfamical, and it was published on Shabbat. So our whole discussion is framed by this one Shabbat piece.
That's exactly right. We're looking squarely at the history as it's presented in this particular article. It lays out these events not just as dates on a calendar, but as, well, pivotal moments in what it describes as a really persistent, often incredibly intense history of struggle. Right, and the Shabbat article itself makes a point about why it's looking back. It says the goal isn't just, glorifying battles or anything like that.
No, exactly. The purpose stated in the source is more about drawing lessons, understanding the foundations of the nation, the challenges it faced, and according to this article, the challenges that persist.
Okay. And the article frames this history as a continuous effort, doesn't it? First against colonial powers, then later.
Yes, it paints a picture of struggle against domination. And then, crucially, after independence was won, the ongoing need to safeguard that sovereignty. And the article explicitly says, right near the start, that the month of March takes center stage in this whole narrative.
Center stage,
Uh,
because so many decisive things happened then.
Apparently so, according to this source. A real concentration of significant events in that short time frame.
Okay, let's unpack this article from Shabbat then. It starts by setting the scene. Eritrea's history defined by struggle, first for freedom, then to keep it. And March is key. So where does the article begin this March timeline?
Well, the Have-Them Tesfamical article on Shabbat kicks things off with a date that really resonates in Eritrea, March 20th, 1977. That's the date, according to this source, that the town of Nakfa was liberated by Eritrean fighters.
Nakfa, okay. Yeah, that name carries a lot of weight. The Shabbat article itself calls it a symbol of perseverance. Why was liberating it on that day in 1977 so important based on this account? What makes it stand out?
Well, a key thing the Shabbat article emphasizes is that Nakfa wasn't just another town liberated. It highlights this critical point. It was the only town in Eritrea, once freed by the liberation fighters, the EPLF specifically, that the Ethiopian army, the Dergue regime's forces, could actually never take back.
Never, despite trying.
Exactly. They tried relentlessly, according to the source, but they never recaptured Nakfa. So it wasn't just a temporary victory, it became this permanent foothold, a strategic anchor they couldn't dislodge.
That really explains the symbolic power the article talks about, a permanent gain against such a strong opponent.
Precisely. And the Shabbat article stresses how, during the really tough years of the struggle, Nakfa served as a reliable sanctuary, a safe base. The Ethiopian army, as described here, launched numerous deadly battles trying to get it back.
Deadly battles.
Yeah, the source even mentions that their kind of desperate slogan for these attempts was apparently Nakfa or death, which really tells you how important both sides saw it. But despite all that, they failed every time.
Nakfa or death. Wow, that phrase from the source really hits home the intensity. So holding Nakfa wasn't just symbolic, it had a wider impact. What does the article say about that?
The source states pretty clearly that holding Nakfa had both symbolic and a material importance.
Yeah.
Symbolically, as you said, just liberating it and keeping it boosted morale enormously. It gave people, the article argues, real hope that independence wasn't just a dream, it could actually happen.
Right, made it tangible.
Exactly. And materially, well, it was that crucial safe base. Logistics, planning, regrouping, indispensable for continuing the fight, according to this account.
And the legacy, as the Shabbat article points out, is still very visible today, right? It's not just history.
Absolutely. The article draws a direct line. It highlights that in recognition of the town's huge importance and the sacrifices made there, Eritrea named its national currency the Nakfa.
The Nakfa.
Yeah. So as the article notes, it's this daily reminder for everyone of that specific struggle, the resilience shown there, the hope it represented.
That's incredible. Linking a battle site directly to the money people use every day, it anchors the memory right into the present. So the source says liberating Nakfa paved the way for freeing other places later on between 77 and 88. It was a starting point, a catalyst.
That's the argument presented in the Hampton Tesfa-Michael article, yes. Holding Nakfa, having that secure base, it built momentum. It provided a platform to launch other operations, leading, as the source describes, to freeing other decisive places over the following years, gradually weakening the Ethiopian presence.
Okay, so Nakfa is foundational. Let's follow the article's timeline forward. It moves from Nakfa in 77 to another March event a few years later, and this is where, as you mentioned earlier, the source uses that intriguing name, the stealth offensive.
Yes, the Shabbat article points to March 26, 1983. This marks the start of what the source calls the seventh offensive by the Ethiopian Dergue regime against the EPLF. And it gets called the stealth offensive because, as the article states, it was planned and carried out really secretly. Stealthily is the word used, trying to catch them off guard.
A surprise attack, basically. Why, then? Why did the Dergue launch the secret offensive at that particular moment, according to the perspective in the Shabbat article? What was their thinking?
Well, the article explains the rationale attributed to the Dergue command. They apparently believe the EPLF was significantly weakened after the previous offensive, the sixth one, which had ended just 7 months before.
Ah, they sensed vulnerability.
That seems to be the idea presented. They saw a window, and the source adds another layer. The Dergue leadership was also trying to recover from the frustration and humiliation of that failed sixth offensive. So it was partly about trying to regain lost ground, militarily and maybe psychologically too.
Right, trying to turn the tables after setbacks. The source mentions the timing exactly 7 months after the sixth offensive ended, launching March 26, 83. How did the EPLF handle this surprise attack, according to the Hampton Tesfa-Michael article?
The Shabbat article is clear. This seventh offensive, despite being challenging and trying for surprise, was met with fierce resistance. It says that after weeks of really heavy fighting, the offensive just failed. The EPLF managed to repel this major assault.
And the article makes a point about how they managed that, doesn't it? About the EPLF's characteristics.
It does. It touches on how the EPLF often compensated for being outnumbered by the larger Ethiopian army. According to the source, they did it through perseverance, dedication, and creativity. It kind of echoes that theme of resilience we saw with Nakfa. Not just brute force, but cleverness and sheer will.
So another big Dergue push, trying a different tactic stealth, but ultimately thwarted by that same resilience and creativity as this Shabbat account describes it. March really does seem to be a month of these intense clashes. What's the next major March event the article focuses on? It feels like things are starting to shift.
Moving along the timeline in the Hampton Tesfa-Michael article, we get to March 1984. Now, according to the source, the EPLF, after holding defensive lines and trenches near Nakfa and on the Sahel and Barca fronts for about 5 years, they launched a major operation themselves.
Ah, so they're initiating now.
Seems so. This operation was aimed at destroying a major Ethiopian military setup called the Wukwa Command.
Wukwa Command. The source explains that name.
Yes, it says Wukwa means hit hard in Amharic. And it wasn't just a small unit. The article describes it as a really substantial Ethiopian military presence, dug in along a defensive line that stretched for 100 kilometers.
100 kilometers. That's a huge front line. Sounds formidable. And how quickly did the EPLF manage to break this massive command, according to the Shabbat article?
This is pretty remarkable, as presented in the source. It states quite emphatically that the Wukwa Command, despite its size and that 100-kilometer length, was destroyed in a matter of 2 days.
2 days. For a 100-kilometer front, that's incredibly fast. So just a very well-planned, very effective operation described by the source. What was the strategic result? The article must see this as a really crucial moment.
Oh, absolutely. According to the perspective in the Shabbat article, this was a total game changer. Successfully destroying the Wukwa Command so quickly allowed the EPLF to fundamentally alter their entire military posture. The source explicitly says this victory enabled them to shift their tactics from a defense to an attacking capability.
Wow. Okay, that is huge. From mainly reacting and holding ground to actively planning and launching their own major offensives, that changes everything.
Exactly. And the Shabbat article then describes the next 4 years or so, after March 1984. With this new offensive capability, the EPLF spent that time focusing on weakening the Ethiopian army at the fronts, sort of softening them up, degrading their strength before launching even bigger pushes later. So this operation in March 84, as presented here, was the key that unlocked that strategic shift.
Okay, so let's trace this thread from the source again. Nakfa in 77 resilience, sanctuary. The foiled stealth offensive in 83, ingenuity under pressure. The Wuquan command destroyed in 84, enabling the shift to offense. All major March events. It feels like this is building towards something monumental. What's the next big one? The article details for March, maybe the most significant.
Yes, the Shabbat article really focuses in on this next event, giving it a lot of detail. It portrays it as possibly the most decisive battle of the entire independence struggle. This took place between March 17th and 19th, 1988, the Battle of Af'abet. According to the source, this battle led to the complete destruction of what it calls one of the strongest commands of the Dergue regime and the liberation of Af'abet town itself. The article describes this battle as the one that shifted the balance of power decisively.
Okay, strongest command, shifted the balance decisively. Let's unpack the details from the Shabbat article. What was this Ethiopian force, the NATO command, actually like? How big, how strong was it, according to this source?
The Shabbat article paints a really vivid picture. This NATO command was the main force based around Af'abet, and the source says it had been the base for Ethiopia's strongest army unit since way back in 1979. Size-wise, around 20,000 troops.
20,000, that's a major force.
And the source doesn't mince words. It calls this specific force the strongest army in the history of Ethiopia up to that point, just emphasizing the sheer military might gathered there.
Strongest army in Ethiopian history. That's a direct quote from the source. Wow, what was it made of? The article mentions a top mechanized unit.
Yeah, it breaks down the composition, 10 infantry battalions, which is substantial. But the real teeth, according to the article, were its firepower and mobility. 60 BM-21 rocket launchers, those are the Grads, plus lots of heavy artillery, 130 millimeters and 122 millimeter mortars. And their defense was anchored by this massive trench system, over 90 kilometers long.
90 kilometers of trenches.
Yeah. Plus, the source notes, 13 foreign military advisors were present, suggesting significant external support and expertise. And Af'abet town itself was the nerve center, the headquarters for this whole massive operation.
Okay, so heavily armed, well-advised, deeply dug in, 20,000 elite troops. How on earth did the EPLF, usually outnumbered, plan to tackle that, according to the strategy described in the Shabbat article?
The source describes the EPLF operation as brilliantly planned and efficiently executed. It wasn't just a head-on clash. The article says it kicked off on March 17th, initially targeting one specific part, the 14th Division of the Ethiopian Army. Then, the EPLF launched what the source calls a massive and well-coordinated offensive on 3 flanks, simultaneously.
3 flanks at once. Against that kind of defense sounds incredibly complex, high risk. What was the immediate result of this coordinated attack, based on the Shabbat account? Did the Ethiopian defenses hold initially?
According to the article, the EPLF's coordinated assault achieved immediate, stunning success. It says they instantly destroyed the command posts of the front lines. And crucially, the source emphasizes they caught the enemy completely by surprise, despite all those trenches. They effectively smashed the first line of trenches, that huge 90-kilometer-plus barrier.
Smashed the first line.
Yeah. And this initial breakthrough, the source says, threw the Ethiopian army into disarray, pushing them back towards their secondary defenses, really disrupting their whole plan.
Surprise seems key again. The source mentioned the Ethiopians had been fighting a war of attrition there for 9 years. Maybe they got complacent, didn't expect such a fast, devastating blow.
That's exactly the angle the Shabbat article takes. It suggests the Ethiopian command just didn't foresee being overrun with such stunning speed and suffering such heavy pressure with enormous human and material loss from an enemy they'd contained for so long. This shock factor seems central to the initial collapse described in the source.
Okay, so the battle's raging, EPLF has surprise, they've broken the main trench line, the Ethiopians are falling back. What happens next that leads to the truly decisive outcome the source describes? It points to a fateful decision by the Ethiopian commanders.
Yes, according to this account in Shabbat. As things were rapidly deteriorating for them, the Ethiopian commanders decided to pull back their main fighting force, specifically their 29th Mechanized Unit. The plan was a strategic withdrawal to their main garrison inside Af'abet town itself.
Trying to regroup at headquarters.
Right. The source says they believe fresh supplies, reinforcements, and their big guns would be waiting there, allowing them to stabilize and hit back.
Makes sense as a plan under pressure, but the article mentions specific geography playing a role here.
It does. A critical detail. The only route for this large force and all its vehicles to get back into Af'abet garrison was through a narrow passage called Adi Shirim. The article calls it the only gateway, highlighting its bottleneck potential.
A bottleneck. So the retreat path itself was vulnerable, and the article describes a race for this choke point.
Exactly. According to the Shabbat article, citing historians it incorporates, it became a desperate race. You had this huge convoy, the source mentions over 70 tanks, armored units, trucks full of ammo, all rushing for this narrow pass at Adi Shiram. At the same time, the EPLF's own mechanized units, having broken through, were racing to the same spot to cut them off.
A race to the bottleneck. And the outcome there.
The source describes the outcome at Adi Shiram as basically inevitable at that stage. The sheer number of retreating Ethiopian vehicles trying to squeeze through the narrow pass doomed them. As the article puts it, there was no way for the Ethiopian military convoy to pass once the first truck was hit and blocked the way. Completely trapped. Unable to move, unable to reach the supposed safety and supplies in Af'abet. At that point, the article states very clearly, victory became inevitable for the EPLF. They had the core of the Nadu command cornered and immobilized.
It sounds like a combination of brilliant EPLF tactics, the surprise, the multi-flank attack, breaking the line, and then seizing that critical choke point just sealed the deal, as the source tells it. But then the article describes something truly awful happening after the command was essentially defeated. It uses the word inferno.
Yes, this is one of the most harrowing parts of the Shabbat article's account of Af'abet. Apparently, when the news of the total collapse of the Nadu command reached the Ethiopian Army HQ further south, the generals made a horrific decision. The source describes it as self-destructive. Rather than let the trapped soldiers and all that valuable equipment be captured, they decided to destroy it all themselves.
Destroy their own trapped troops and equipment.
The source claims the Ethiopian Air Force was ordered to bomb its own men. For hours. The justification given in the article was that, from the air, they couldn't tell their soldiers apart from the masses of vehicles and equipment also trapped below.
That's unbelievable.
The article uses incredibly graphic language. The flames were rising high, and in the trucks, the ammunition and missiles kept exploding continuously. Black smoke was everywhere. It paints a picture of absolute devastation caused by friendly fire on a massive scale.
A self-inflicted catastrophe.
The Shabbat article says eyewitnesses described the battlefield after this bombardment as looking like an inferno from a biblical scene, just emphasizing the sheer horror of it, as recounted in this source.
So after this terrible battle, the trapping at Adi Shiram, this awful self-destruction, Af'abet itself was finally liberated. When did the EPLF take the town, according to the source?
Af'abet town, that vital headquarters for the Ethiopian Army since '79, was liberated by the EPLF on March 19, 1988, marking the end of that three-day battle.
And the gains for the EPLF weren't just the town, were they? The article details massive amounts of captured equipment. How critical was that?
Absolutely huge and strategically vital, according to the Shabbat article. The Ethiopians lost one of their most experienced and war-hardened armies, a massive blow. And the EPLF, they captured, well, an incredible haul. The source lists 50 tanks, 100 trucks, and huge amounts of light and heavy weapons. It specifically calls out the 130mm mortars and those BM-21 rocket launchers as being particularly valuable captures.
Capturing 50 tanks, heavy artillery, rocket launchers, that must have completely transformed the EPLF's own firepower overnight.
So how did this victory at Af'abet change the whole war, according to the perspective in the Shabbat source? It called it a decisive shift earlier.
The article by Haptem Tesfamakel is definitive here. Af'abet was a game changer. It opened a new chapter. It shifted the balance of power decisively across the board in favor of the EPLF. And maybe just as important, it profoundly shook the Dergue regime back in Addis Ababa. It showed their strongest forces were beatable. Did this massive military shift get noticed outside the region? Did it change how the world saw the conflict? The source mentioned media coverage.
Yes, the Shabbat article notes that after Af'abet, the Eritrean struggle gained way more international attention. It says big media outlets acknowledged and broadcasted the victory, suggesting it finally broke through onto the world stage in a bigger way.
So a strategic turning point recognized internationally, huge psychological impact too, presumably. And the article directly links the weapons captured at Af'abet to later EPLF successes.
That's a key legacy point the source makes. It states that the vast amount of gear seized at Af'abet later enabled the EPLF to stage an attack on the strategically vital port city of Massawa. Leveraging those captured tanks and artillery, just 2 years later, they launched the famous Operation Fenkill to liberate Massawa. And the article describes that specific battle, Fenkill, as the biggest tank battle Africa has ever seen.
Wow. So the offensive capability gained from destroying Wuqua Command in March 84, combined with the hardware captured at Af'abet in March 88, directly fueled later massive operations like Fenkell. The Shabait article really portrays these March events as strategically interconnected, building towards final victory.
Yeah.
Okay, we've spent a good amount of time on these pivotal March moments during the Independence War, as laid out in the source, but the Habtam Tesfamical article on Shabait doesn't stop there. It brings the story forward into the post-independence era, to March 1999.
Yes, the article makes the point that March continued to be significant even after independence in 1991, specifically in terms of defending that sovereignty. It focuses on the conflict that the source refers to as the TPLF-led Ethiopia's invasion of Eritrean sovereign territory in 1999.
Right, and the specific battle highlighted for March 1999 is the Battle of Eritrea.
That's one. March 14th to 16th, 1999. The source emphasizes that in this battle, it was the next generation, the Eritrean youth, who succeeded the freedom fighters, who showed unmatched heroic acts defending the country's borders against this invasion.
Who were they up against in that battle, according to the Shabait article? What was the scale of the attacking force described?
The source specifies the force was the military under the TPLF-led Ethiopia, and it describes their deployment as huge. More than 10 infantry divisions and hundreds of tanks thrown into the assault on Eritrean territory.
10 divisions, hundreds of tanks. Another massive force described by the source, and the article uses some very strong words to describe the tactics used by the TPLF-led forces in this battle.
It does. The Habtam Tesfamical article is quite critical here. It calls their military tactic World War I-like and even uncivilized. The source claims they used a strategy of pushing huge numbers of soldiers into narrow areas, essentially using them as cannon fodder.
Cannon fodder.
Yeah, implying a tactic of mass human wave assaults with little regard for casualties. The article says this approach was appalling to the entire world. That's the specific harsh language used in this source to characterize their tactics.
A very strong condemnation in the source material. So given that description of the tactics and the size of the force, what was the outcome of the Battle of Eritrea, according to the Shabait account?
The source reports a decisive Eritrean defensive victory. It states that all TPLF divisions were crushed. Their heavy firepower came to a halt. The result is described as a calamity of the TPLF's human wave and combat arms, again saying this outcome was appalling to the entire world. So this Shabait account presents it as a definitive repulsion of a large invasion force that used heavily criticized methods.
It's certainly clear from the Shabait article that March pops up again and again, not just for turning points in the Independence War, but also in key moments defending that independence later on. The source really frames March as this consistently critical month. So, stepping back from the specific battles, what's the bigger picture? What does this whole March narrative add up to, according to the broader reflections in the Habtam Tesfamical article on Shabait? It must offer some thoughts on the overall cost and meaning of all this conflict.
Yes, it does reflect on the immense cost. The Shabait article acknowledges the huge losses, enormous amount of human and capital resources suffered by both Eritreans and Ethiopians over these many decades of war. It also talks about the unimaginable opportunities for development that were missed because of it all.
A shared loss, then?
That's the sentiment expressed. The source suggests the people themselves, Eritreans and Ethiopians, do not have a reason to fight such bloody wars, pointing to shared values and culture that should allow peaceful coexistence.
Okay, if the source suggests there's no inherent reason for the peoples to fight, what does it identify as the main driver of all these conflicts? This is where the article presents a very specific viewpoint, and as we said, we need to report this neutrally, just conveying what the Shabait article argues.
Absolutely. So according to the specific perspective laid out in the Shabait article, the primary causes for these conflicts emanate from externally induced policies. The source explicitly attributes this to a long-held belief, which connects to outside powers, stating that Eritrea doesn't serve the West's interests.
Okay, so the article points to external interests and policies as the root cause.
Yes, it claims the strategic view and the policies stemming from it were tried time and again with successive Ethiopian regimes over decades, essentially arguing for a pattern of external manipulation driving regional conflict. The source states this strategy cost Eritreans dearly, but ultimately has failed. That is the core argument presented within this Shabait article regarding the fundamental causes.
Got it. It's crucial we frame that as the specific analysis from the source. The article then touches on the period after 2018, when the state of war between Eritrea and Ethiopia formally ended. What does it say about the challenges to that peace, again, from its perspective?
It acknowledges the 2018 peace agreement was a major step, but it then claims that even after peace was declared, those who saw peace and stability in this region as a threat to their interests have been trying to thwart it. So the source's perspective is that undermining efforts continued even after the official peace deal.
And how does the source claim these undermining efforts were happening post-2018?
The Shabbat article specifically states this is proven by the attempts to resurrect the now-defunct EPLF regime by different actors under different guises and through overt actions. That's the specific assertion made in the Habtam Tesmichael article about challenges to the peace after 2018, pointing to alleged attempts to bring back the TPLF by various actors. Again, strictly reporting the claim made in this source.
Understood. Just reporting the source's claims. And the article wraps up by coming back to the reason for remembering all these difficult events from March, right? It circles back to the purpose.
It does. It concludes by stating clearly that remembering these heroic struggles is not for the sake of glorification of war. The stated aim, according to the article, is to remind the people of these two countries, Eritrea and Ethiopia, to learn from past mistakes. It explicitly calls for leaving behind the last 80 years of zero-sum game thinking.
Zero-sum game, meaning one side's gain is the other's loss.
Exactly. And the article proposes moving towards development based on cooperation and peaceful coexistence for mutual benefit. So the idea presented is that understanding this past, as recounted here, is essential for building that different cooperative future, despite the ongoing challenges the source perceives.
So this Shabbat article takes us on quite a journey through March. From those incredibly tough, pivotal battles like Nakfa and Af'abet during the independence struggle, through defending sovereignty later at Eger then reflecting on the huge costs, presenting its specific view on external pauses, and finally ending with this call to learn from it all for a cooperative future.
It definitely provides a very specific, detailed narrative arc, all viewed through the lens of events highlighted for the month of March by this particular source, the Shabbat article. It gives you real insight into the Eritrean experience and perspective, as presented here, the resilience, the strategic shifts, and their analysis of the forces they believe shaped their history in the region. And looking closely at source material like this, understanding the specific viewpoints presented, it really helps appreciate the depth and the different interpretations of a nation's path.
Absolutely. We've unpacked the liberation of Nakfa, foiling the stealth offensive, the Wukwa command destruction, enabling that crucial shift, the absolutely game-changing Battle of Af'abet, and then the Battle of Eritrea post-independence, all framed as key March events by this Shabbat article. And we've looked at its reflections on the cost and its very specific claims about external factors driving the conflicts. And given that the source itself places such a strong emphasis on learning from this incredibly difficult past to build cooperation, while also pointing to what it sees as persistent external challenges, well, it leaves you with a challenging thought, doesn't it? How do nations, especially those with histories like this one described, filled with intense conflict, immense sacrifice, and this perceived external interference, how do they balance that vital need to remember to honor the past struggles with the very practical work of building lasting peace and cooperation with neighbors day to day? Especially when, as this source suggests, they feel outside forces might still be working against that peace. It's a complex balancing act. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into March in Eritrea's history, drawing exclusively from the perspective and details provided in the Habtam Tesfamichael article published on Shabbat.